have the honor of speaking to an unusual man. We might call him in the world of business an outlier. He is the senior pastor of Dunamis Gospel Church International and overseer of many churches around the world, Dr. Paul ENENCHE. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Muyiwa, for...
It's a real joy to be able to sit down with you. We see you on television from afar and see the many conferences you speak at around the world. But let me come to the very beginning for you. I know that there was an interesting moment your mother had an encounter with God in the 50s. I think it was 1958 or something. Tell us a bit about that. What happened there?
Thank you, Muyiwa, for this time. My mother had come from a pagan background, especially on her mother's side. And everyone had been worshippers of the traditional worship. But something happened to her. She said it was in the year thereabout of 1958. She was exposed to the gospel. And then one night she had a vision, a revelation of Jesus Christ hanging on the cross. And then she looked up and Jesus said, "All I want from you is to just hold the helm of my garment for the rest of your life. And I'm going to sort you out. I'm going to sort your destiny, your future." She had no child at that time. I'm going to help you. And even though she wasn't literate in terms of formal education, but she held on to Jesus Christ that she encountered throughout her life. And when the children came, she began to introduce her children, including myself, to Jesus. She would wake us up every morning.
Let me ask, when you look back, when you think back to the early years, and I know your life is so full of counseling, speaking, and all these things, but if you were to stop for a moment and think back to your early years, what are the pictures that come to mind as you think about your mother showing you about Christ and talking to you about Christ? What are the pictures that flood your mind?
Exciting pictures. My mother's impact was unparalleled. She would wake us up every day, 5 a.m., and tell us about Jesus Christ. The little scriptures she knew, she would teach us about the scriptures, tell us what to avoid, tell us to avoid drink, avoid alcohol, avoid smoking, avoid women, and so forth. And she would lay hands on her children, practically lay hands on you. And we went into the world like that.
And for you, at what point did you then walk into your own faith and experience with God? Because mother's covering was great. That's right. Mother's covering propelled you to a certain point. But then Paul ENENCHE's experience has to start. What point did that happen for you?
That was sometime around 1979. We had great revival in the city where I was. And great men of God were coming into town. People like Pastor E. Adeboye and several of such men were coming into town and having great revivals. We had camp meetings where youth, teenagers, and young adults would be in such camps for like 3 days. I remember one we had for 3 days. It was a fasting program. I think that was the first time I encountered Jesus for real. I fasted for 3 days without food and had encounters with the Lord that changed my life.
You know, you say encounters with the Lord because many people look at you now. They would look at you speaking and the power of God being expressed and all that. I'm interested to know, in those early years, those 3 days, what was it that Jesus said to you? What are some of the things that he spoke to your heart that you're free to share now?
Within those 3 days, I can't specifically lay hold on words I heard because there are times the things that God does in our hearts are beyond words. But one thing I knew was that there was a passion for God, a passion for the best of God, a passion for everything God has in store. That was what I would call hunger that couldn't be conquered, incurable addiction.
Let's talk about that, because I gather when because you're a qualified medical doctor.
That's right.
So is your wife, and your wife actually comes from a long line of bigwig doctors, professors, and the likes. Yeah. But you recount that being a doctor yourself, there was something that was much deeper than curing people, that you found you couldn't detach, you found you couldn't sleep.
That's right.
What was the problem, Doctor?
I was very miserable as a medical student first, and then a medical doctor. Very miserable in the sense that I had passion for the patients that was beyond what my medical practice could handle. I had passion for their souls, I had passion for their minds, and then passion for their healings. If, for example, we did ward rounds like Friday morning, and I saw a patient that was maybe terminally ill, and then Monday morning we came back for ward round, and I asked, where is this patient? And they say he's dead over the weekend. Then I'll be miserable for the whole of the week.
Wow.
Right. And then I remember that brief period, I was also ministering to their physical health. Many got healed at that time. So it was something that was like beyond what my medical training could handle, that I was experiencing.
Were there those around you back then who would look at you and say, come on, Paul, why are you being so fanatical? Calm down. Were there any who said that?
So many of them.
And have you seen any of them come back to you now and say?
Plenty of them. Wow. I've had teachers, professors who despised us then, who we felt were wasting time. What do you think? What are you feeling? And so on, who have returned back now. I remember one of my teachers brought a girl here who she said was born with sickle cell anemia, SS genotype. And she told me, Pastor, this child was born in my hands at the teaching hospital, and the mother has met me, and she's a sickler. I want you to pray for her. And that was humbling, and we prayed, and God heard us. God bless.
It's such a pleasure to ride in the time capsule with you as you took us back to the 50s with your mum and then the 70s with you. But let's come to the now, because I had the opportunity of sitting in your church service. I'd heard much about it. I'd heard the throngs of people that flow through. I'd heard of the dome that you're building, 70,000 seater dome. And so I sat in the service, wanted to see myself. And I came to service number 5.
That's right.
And 6.
That's right.
And every Sunday, just in your branch, you do 6 services. And I thought, my Lord, I'm counting people like ants. When did that start for you, Dr. Paul?
I think what happened, I would date back to like 6 years ago. We're just running 3 services.
And that's bad enough by itself, because in London, you're running 1 service, you're doing good. Now you're running 3 services.
Yeah. And those weren't fully filled services, though. We had the first service was filled to under the gallery, the second was filled completely, and then the third was halfway filled. And I was traveling to London, England, and then was in the aircraft and received the voice of God telling me to start 5 services. At that time, I had been trusting God. We're like probably 6,000-7,000 people.
So this instruction wouldn't have made logical sense?
No sense at all. Wow. No sense.
But you went ahead.
I went ahead and then announced the next Sunday we're having 5 services of grace. And you couldn't believe what happened. The 5 services were filled to the gallery the first Sunday, except the last service that was filled till under the gallery. And I was shocked. And the people were shocked.
But let me ask you, though, because much of the time when people are talking about Paul ENENCHE, they talk about the crowds. They talk about the great miracles, which are wonderful. But I wonder if there's sometimes we're missing something. What are some of the social, you might call it social justice or community things that the church does that's touching lives that you're free to talk about?
We've had God helped us in so many ways. Let me start from the ministration to the widows and orphans. Again, about the same time I was traveling to the UK, I saw in a vision in the aircraft, a woman was speaking to another one. And she said, the schools are about to resume and I don't have money to send my children to school. And right from that revelation, God ministered to me and to go and pick up all the widows that are not able to send their children to school. So I returned back from that trip and announced in the church, and the widows came We screened to find out the genuine cases. And then we began immediately and sent scores of children to school. We spent millions in Nigerian currency every single term and every single session.
And that still goes on now?
It goes on probably till Jesus comes. And then we also began to empower the widows. We have a Women of Destiny group. We call them the Wings group. And then we empower them, teach them trade, and then empower them financially to start. And many of them are doing very well.
I really want to get to a point that I know most people are intrigued about, because one of the hallmarks of Paul ENENCHE's ministry is signs and wonders. And it happens all the time. Do you ever see some that happen that shock you yourself? Because, I mean, you've been doing this for decades now.
Yes, we've seen a couple. I remember a young prostitute testified not too long ago. She had lived a prostitutious life all her life. And one day she had an appointment with one of her customers and took her to a hotel. And right in that hotel, they were watching the television, and then we were preaching.
Oh, Lord, they had the wrong channel on.
The wrong channel on. And the power of God hit this lady, and she left immediately from the hotel, returned back home, and traced the church, came to church, and gave her life to Christ. And right now she's been empowered financially, and she's doing business. I saw a young man who had accident the same day, probably had cervical, whatever, but she came to church with a neck collar. Unknown to me, the accident was fresh, and that same day, she came with a sister who brought her. I never knew. If I had known that the accident was the same day and that probably it will damage anything if we didn't do well, I wouldn't have dared it. But
that's being honest there.
That's right. But I went straight and I said, I'm going to pray for you. He said, go ahead. Take off the collar. And he was still watching me. And I prayed for him, asked him to move the neck. He couldn't move the neck. He just tried with pain and it wasn't moving. I prayed again and prayed the third time. And then he moved the neck left, right. And the whole church went wild. Now, it was after that happened that we knew what had happened. That same day, coincidentally, a doctor from Canada was in the church. And we called him forth and we said, Doctor, what had just happened? And he told me, Pastor, if that miracle didn't work, that man would be paralyzed for life. So that was amazing.
Wow. One final thing, the miracles are countless. The crowds are countless. The many reports are countless. At the end of the day, when you're in the room by yourself, when they're all gone, what is the thing that means the most to you, that gives you the most peace, Dr. Paul ENENCHE?
The most important thing to me is whether I have done the will of God and to return back to his presence, which is the greatest asset of my personal life and ministry, and to be sure that I'm on course with him, and to be sure that I would hear, well done, thou good and faithful servant, at the end. Like I said at the beginning, it's an incurable addiction and passion for God. So I try to rekindle that. And once that atmosphere is created, I tell people, I said, at times coming out from his presence is like a distraction compared to what I experienced with him.